against Christians. There are things that people publish that are offensive. The question is, when is it not so much offensive, when is it gratuitously offensive? And I have a line there. You know, if I'm going to argue my position with a believer, whether it's a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian or anybody else, first of all, in this society, whatever people say, I'm careful about what I say. And I don't just go in and you know, take no prisoners attitude. I'm very careful in what I'm going to say. I'm going to gauge it, etc. Even though inside my head I may have very radical views, and at least on a philosophical level, more extreme views. I'm not an extremist in my actions, so I can be, you know, hardcore, absolute, 100% philosophically anti-theist, and not give a damn what you believe, as long as it's not going to affect my life. I am sensitive sometimes to people's beliefs, and so I'm not going to do so. I'm not going to draw an offensive picture of Muhammad or Jesus, etc. In most cases, and I myself am troubled when I see it. You know, my son, who is otherwise a wonderful person, happens to think that South Park is funny. I happen to think it's one of the unfunniest things I've ever seen. But they have things that are blatantly, I mean crudely offensive. And the one thing I remember seeing that offended me, it didn't offend me in the sense that we're talking about, but I just found it ridiculous. But it was a figure of Jesus who was pooping all over the room. I mean, what do you have to do that for? I mean, that's not making a comment of any kind. On the other hand, you could make the argument, well, you know, there should be no sacred figures, and this is the way to take that to the extreme. I think it's ridiculous. I don't watch South Park. I dislike it intensely, but I don't want to censor it, because I don't want to be the one who says, okay, this kind of offense is necessary, because these people need to be taken down a peg. These people have to see that what they believe is ridiculous, or the way they act is ridiculous, and it's very important because that's the only way we're going to get social change or stop these people trying to do certain kinds of things. But it's not up to me to say where the line is. Sometimes you do have to take an extreme action, not violent, but extreme, that is offensive in order to get the attention you need to get something going. Even an argument where it's just screaming at each other in a situation where you couldn't talk about it before, in some situations could be a move forward. So the question is, you know, there's a civility question and there's a rights question. And these questions, I believe, are situational. There is a time when the right thing to do is to insult the Pope. Sometimes that is the right thing. I mean, to insult him top to bottom. Some things the right thing to do is to just shut up. And you don't know when it is, so you can't make a rule, don't insult the Pope, because sometimes the Pope deserves to be insulted. And sometimes you have to know when to stop. But who gets to make the rule? Who gets to decide that in this situation you can't say those things?
But how can you be an ally to someone who disagrees with your sensibilities when you are trying to criticize something that they may think, in that instance, they may think that you are that you've gone too far. But as we've said, who gets to decide that? So how do you remain an ally to someone, especially in a movement like this, the interfaith movement, and still apply your ability to criticize?
That's always been a trouble for me, because I've always been, well, less so now, but I've been very politically active. I've been very politically active in the United States and in Israel, because I lived in Israel for 6 years. And I often found myself alongside people who were just wacko. I had a professor when I was getting my master's in public administration. He had a sign on his door that said, apologize for being a little bit too crude, but the sign on his door said, sometimes the assholes are on your side, which is true. So for example, when I was in New Orleans in graduate school, I was involved, this was in the 1980s, I was involved with a group called the Movement for Peace in Central America. So at the time, you had the civil wars going on in Guatemala and El Salvador and in Nicaragua, and the United States was supporting quasi-fascist regime in El Salvador that was bombing its people. It was supporting the Contras against the Sandinistas, and the Contras were the dictators before, and we had decided now they're for democracy, even though for the 50 years they were in power, they weren't for democracy, all of a sudden they're Democrats. And so this was a group, a coalition of groups that wanted to change American policy. And not support the Contras, not support the quasi-fascist regime in El Salvador, and to work for a peaceful solution. So some of the people in there were, like the college Democrats. Some of the people were longtime public activists. There were a lot of Catholic activists. New Orleans is a big Catholic city, so there were Pax Christi, I think was the name of the group. There was even a small Mennonite peace group there in New Orleans, Mennonites. Okay, but they were great. There were a couple of free-floating radicals like me, and we had three in New Orleans, 3 Marxist groups. Wow. 2 Trotskyist groups, one of which was totally wacko, but the most wacko was a pro-Albanian Stalinist group. Don't ask. Anyway, so most of us, a lot of the group, especially the college Democrats, especially some of the just kind of liberal types who thought this was a bad idea, they were somewhat politically naive. I had been doing political activism for a time. And the Marxist groups, especially the Trotskyist, the Socialist Workers' Party, were trying to take advantage of the naivete because they wanted the group to be a vehicle for their propaganda. And I was, with some of my friends, was constantly arguing, this is not a group, and at the time I belonged to a Democratic Socialist group called Democratic Socialists of America, which was really social democratic. And we would have arguments. They wanted to put their newspaper on the table. Well, their newspaper had a hammer and sickle on it. We're trying to convince people who aren't that politically aware to be more politically aware about our foreign policy. We weren't trying to convince them to be members of a group or to convert to an ideology. And the average person, not without reason, seeing a hammer and sickle is going to say, ooh, I don't want to, nothing about this. And these people couldn't let it go. We had one meeting. We were going to have a protest because the Democratic candidates were all going to be speaking at Tulane. This was during an election year. And we had a meeting that was the stupidest meeting I was at. Well, I've been in a lot of stupid meetings, so I don't know. It's one of the stupidest meetings I was at. And we were going over what was going to be on our placards. We didn't want anything, first of all, this was about Central America. So this wasn't the time to bring up South Africa. This wasn't the time to bring up some other things. We fought it out, we hammered it out because we wanted it to be just the message we wanted. Why are Democrats supporting this thing in Central America? We shouldn't be bombing civilians and things like that. And then this other group showed up anyway with their signs. And so half of us just walked out. We weren't even going to be part of this protest. We didn't want to be. So sometimes you the crazies who are on your side, you can't work with them.
All right, with that, I want to open it up to the floor, too. We're running a little bit short on time, so if you guys have any questions, just raise your hand, and you can ask our panelists whatever you thought. Yeah, Troy.
Okay, so we spoke about, not wanting to draw lines for offensiveness. And it seems like drawing the lines for the physical harm that you can cause to a people or peoples are much easier to draw. We depend on our governments to help us draw those lines. When is it too much pain physically to cause to a person or peoples? And there are gray areas like the disciplining of children that are highly debated, where there is a constructive amount of, it is in some beliefs that there's a constructive amount of pain to cause to a child, to discipline them, to mold them into a better person. But there's a line as well, where it becomes not constructive anymore. So why do you think those protections are more difficult for the spirit of a person, or the soul of a person? When do you offend a person's soul so much that you hurt them in a way that it might not be recoverable? Is it advisable then to suppress the freedom of speech of a person?
Well, in Europe there are laws against hate speech. In the US not so much, given our First Amendment rights. But in many countries there are laws against, so this idea of free speech being completely free is not true at all. Some societies do draw a line on speech, particularly the type that you described, that could be hurtful or that could incite violence or cause harm to other people. Now the question becomes, where do you draw a line on this? I'm personally not in favor of drawing lines, partly because of what David just explained, is first of all, how do you figure out where the line is? And number two, who draws that line? And who enforces that that line has not been crossed? That becomes a very sketchy issue. For example, one of the things that, even in the Charlie Hebdo situation, the Muslims in France had talked about is that there is laws against anti-Semitism in France and in Germany for a good reason. Now, they argued that the cartoons were similar. They were anti-Muslim, not anti-Jewish, but anti-Muslim, but very similar. That they were provocative, offensive, and it could incite violence, further marginalization of a minority group that was already marginalized in society. So people have made that argument, but of course they did not win the argument because the politics of France does not favor that a ruling would be made in favor of the Muslim minority in France, as the politics of Europe, at least today, is much more, although there is rising anti-Semitism in Europe also, but it is much more likely that the establishment structure would rule in favor of the minority Jewish community than in favor of the minority Muslim community. So that's why I'm not in favor of drawing these lines, because it all becomes subjective as to what the power structure is at that moment in time, and who gets to enforce that power structure. Now, in terms of the question that Charles asked over here, the question that David was answering, how do you allow, particularly in a group setting like the Interfaith Center, the Interfaith Movement, where there are people from all across faith traditions and non-faith traditions that are working together for a common cause, and how do you keep the group harmony, particularly during provocative situations like we saw with Charlie Hebdo? In my view, these opportunities, as offensive as the cartoon was, and we've all explained why it was offensive, they actually provide an opportunity for dialogue. I look at this as a teachable moment. And so it all depends upon how you approach your life. You can take offense with every offense out there, and there are certainly, you can turn on cable television. I can particularly name one so-called news station that you can turn on and you'll be offended every 5 minutes. The question is, what do you do with that offense? Do you turn that into a movement to be violent or radical against it, or do you use that as a teachable moment, as an opportunity to dialogue with somebody? Even with people that you have profound disagreements with. And there will be Muslims who would be committed to the ideals of secularism, who would be committed to the ideals of our American values, and still they may argue that publishing cartoons like this should be legislated against. You can use that as an opportunity to dialogue, as to show that any infringement of First Amendment rights is actually infringement of religious rights. Because our freedom to practice religion comes from the same amendment that gives us the freedom to speak. We cannot parse that amendment and say we will take it only for practicing my religion, but when it comes to speech, free speech, as offensive as that speech is, I'm going to legislate against it, or I'm going to argue for legislation against it. So it becomes a teachable moment. We can discuss what the First Amendment law actually means. And even within that First Amendment free speech law, there are limits to that law. It is not a unconditional right to speak. As for example, you cannot say fire in a crowded theater. So anything that endangers public safety becomes problematic. So there are, personally, I do not support any limits to free speech, but I do encourage civic groups, civic society, particularly groups like this, to work to use these flashpoints as an opportunity to learn and teach.
Okay. I want to answer your question on a different level, which is a more personal level, because you were also, it sounded like you were asking at a personal level. And I want to overstate the case the other way to make a point. If there's a 6-year-old child, that child will, and especially if they have brothers or sisters, that child is going to be running at least 3 times a day to daddy or mommy saying, Johnny called me a poopy head. Johnny called me a poopy head. I can't take it. Okay. Presumably, when you become an adult, you can deal with somebody calling you a poopy head. Okay. But more than that, there is, all of us can be offended by, personally offended by something. Some of us have thicker skin. Some of us have thinner skin. One of the things that people complain about now in society is we've sort of gone a little bit too far the other way in trying to be so careful about not offending anybody that it actually impoverishes dialogue and impoverishes culture, etc. And an extreme reaction to that was the movie Whiplash. If any of you saw the movie Whiplash, it'd say, hey, I can tell you you're terrific, etc. You'll never become a great musician. You'll never achieve anything, etc. That a little extreme, and even J.K. Simmons thought, he didn't exactly go with the message. But the idea is, when you're an adult, there are things you hold dear. There are beliefs you have that are extremely important. But you're an adult. You're a responsible person. If somebody insults you, there are adult ways to react, and there are childish ways to react, and a lot of adults act in childish ways. I mean, a fight in a bar is childish, even though it ends up with guns and knives. That's stupid. It's childish. Fights over football games are stupid and childish, and adults do that. But in a civil society, an adult has a responsibility, himself or herself, to be able to handle insults, to be able to say, look, you've just insulted my fundamental beliefs, and this is the time where I either say, the hell with you and leave, or I defend them in a mature adult way. Okay? So some of the people who take offense are people who have problems with adulthood. Okay? And their reaction, I don't want somebody to beat me up if I say, hey, look, I don't believe in God, and these are the reasons I think your religion is wrong. If we're in a discussion, some discussions, that's a perfectly legitimate set of things to do. If I just walk up to you in a bar and sit down and then start attacking your religious beliefs, then that's a little bit different. Okay? But I have a responsibility as an adult not to say stupid things to other people. And other people have responsibilities as adults not to moderate their response to insults to themselves. And I think that's a part of the discussion that's really missing.
Well, let me just catch up on one little thing. Since they started with the cartoons about Prophet Muhammad, the question is, how would he have reacted to insults towards him? That's a fair question to ask. It's certainly a question that Muslims have to ask. How would he have reacted if he was personally insulted? I'll narrate a couple of stories from his life.
Hold on, Parvez, can you put a hold there for just a second? I just want to let David know, Dr. Schwam-Baird he has a class that he's teaching and will step out, so it will not be a show of disrespect to anyone in the room.
That's why I'm not looking at my email, and this is my watch.
Okay, go.
That's your opinion.
That is true, I do accept that. So, Dr. Ahmed, if you'd like to
Yeah.
go ahead.
So one time, Prophet Muhammad was sitting with his wife Aisha, and a person walked by, and the person said to Muhammad, he said, "Al-Sam alaikum." It sounds very familiar, very close to "Assalamu alaikum," except there's a world of difference between these two statements.
Uh-oh.
Assalamu alaikum means peace be upon you, and Al-Sam alaikum, which sounds very similar, it means death be upon you.
Oh.
So obviously the Prophet Muhammad's wife Aisha, she became very agitated, and she said some words back to the person, and Prophet Muhammad was sitting just calmly over here, and all he replied was, "And to you too." Now,
That's an adult response.
now the reason behind it is that he probably thought that he could have misheard what he heard. So instead of immediately reacting to it, he said, "Unto you too," giving the person the benefit of the doubt. If he indeed said, "Peace be upon you," then peace be upon you too. And if he said, "Death be upon you," then the same back to you. So that's an adult way of responding. And then, and there are many other examples. One time he was sitting with his friend, his closest friend, Abu Bakr, and somebody was insulting his friend, Abu Bakr. And he kept sitting there and just quietly smiling. And then Abu Bakr started to respond, and Muhammad he stood up and he walked away. And his friend said, "What kind of a friend you are? Somebody was insulting me, and while I was being insulted, you kept on smiling. And the moment I started responding, you walked away." He said, "Well, when you were absorbing that insult, there were angels dancing around you. And I was so pleased to watch your restraint, your self-restraint in the face of provocation. When you started to respond, the angels left you, so I left too." So that's an adult response, right? How do you handle provocation? Every provocation does not require a response. Sometimes it is better not to respond during a provocation because, again, you can use these moments in life as a teachable moment. You can make these divisive moments in life a moment where you can actually build bridges of understanding. So that's kind of the lesson kind of a personal lesson that we can take from difficult situations. How do we improve ourselves from that challenge?
I want to take another question. Do you have one?
It was more of a comment. Going back to what Dr. Ahmed said about satire being effective or not effective. I haven't seen all of the cartoons, obviously, but I'm trying to understand, if any, I don't think you can understand, what is the political point of depicting Prophet Muhammad as a dog? There was no statement to be made in that other than insult. It was intended, in my opinion, as an insult because it's not attacking the hegemony, it's not attacking the hypocrisy, it's not attacking the ideology in any kind of way. Things like that are wrong to me because you're not trying to spark a dialogue. You're not trying to say, "Hey, this is wrong, we should change this." You are targeting an entire group of people on purpose to hurt them. That to me has drawn the line. You've gone past what it is that you state that you're trying to do with your politics, with your satire, with your things like that. You're not being effective.
I think you're right about it, but I just want to take a little bit of a contrarian perspective over here. This is the point that David was making, that often satirists would use satire to bring people who are in positions of high esteem down to ordinary levels. Now I'm not trying to defend the satirist, the cartoonist at Charlie Hebdo, because in my view that was exactly my take, that there is no purpose in depicting a holy figure as a dog. Or in the case of South Park, the way that you described it. Again, these are provocative just for the sake of provocation. It does not further dialogue. But there is a place for provocation in society. Sometimes you need that. And so part of the Charlie Hebdo or the cartoonist, like in the Danish newspapers, actually the editor of the Danish newspaper who did the cartoon on Prophet Muhammad, he wrote a nice article about why he did it. And there was a rationale behind it. He was trying to react to it. You may not agree with the rationale, but I thought that his rationale was actually well thought out, even when I disagreed with his rationale. His rationale was that often Muslims have tried to put markers in society that you can't touch this and you can't discuss that. Kind of your point, when is it okay for somebody to criticize religion? I think it is always okay for somebody to criticize religion, because through that criticism, through that dialogue, better light could be shed on a situation that may not have a lot of light around it. It is perfectly okay to do it. The question becomes how you do it and in what context you do it. So sometimes the cartoonists, whether in Charlie Hebdo or in the Danish newspaper, they were reacting to the prevailing norms where Muslims were pushing hard back against that any criticism of Islam is Islamophobic. In my view, that's not true at all. I do not see that any criticism of Islam to be Islamophobic. You can certainly criticize. It's the question of the manner in which you criticize. For example, Bill Maher had a criticism where he said, he was trying to, again, look at violent incidents in the Muslim world and trying to say, well, all Muslims pretty much condone that, or majority of Muslims condone that. That's not true at all. So again, criticism is not a problem. If somebody wants to look at what does the Quran actually say about violence, what does the traditions actually say about violence, where have Muslims shown restraint, and where they have not shown restraint, that's perfect. Particularly criticizing people's behavior is absolutely necessary, particularly extremists who are engaged in that kind of behavior, whether through satire or through other means. The question is, how do you do it, and in the manner you try to do it, that would kind of carry the day.
One brief, I want to respect everyone's time, especially yours, Dr.
Yeah.
Schwam-Baird, but if you have a
You didn't ask
30
your students to
second,
come and join here?
There's a whole bunch of-
Oh, there's
if you want to put a exclamation point here, go ahead.
Okay, well, actually, I was going to make another point which might leave it all hanging, but in terms of expressions that are extremely offensive, I can think of some that, from my background, from my history, which are really sort of interesting. For example, there was a period in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where a lot of Jews who still identified as Jews were making a strong point against what they saw as the tyranny of the Orthodox in their community. And this includes Israel, which has a very strong secular Jewish identity. One of the things that the Jewish anarchists of London used to do was on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, they would have a banquet where they would serve pork chops.
Uh-oh.
Okay. Now, to an Orthodox Jew, that's about as radical as you can get. But that is an expression of contempt which only makes sense in a Jewish context. If any of the Christians in the room on Yom Kippur, you wouldn't even know when Yom Kippur is, decided to have a bacon cheeseburger, it doesn't mean anything. But for Jews to say, we are having a party, we're letting everybody know, and we're going to be serving pork chops on Yom Kippur, they're making a political statement which is very offensive to people they find very offensive for interfering in their lives, particularly saying, you're not allowed to do that. And what these people are saying, you're not allowed to tell me I'm not allowed to do this, and so I'm going to do it. So sometimes the most offensive thing is the thing to do under a situation. So anyway, that's just to leave with, but I have to go to
Let's
class.
thank our
Thank you.
faculty members and also Charles, our facilitators. Thank you.
Please fill out your surveys.
And anyone who wants to stay for a selfie.
That's your okay.
Thank you very much for coming.
I know.
I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Rachel, this is your tradition. Would you like to?
I know, I heard that.
I think David is.
Tyler says we have him to thank for the selfie stick.
Thank you. David was speaking.
Are we taking the selfie now, or do I have time to record?
We're gonna take it probably now. And,
I don't know if there's.
Everybody's name right and everything.
and,
I don't
Your haircut, by the way.
Thank
you very much.
I don't know if we do, but if not, I can write it down for you. Let me ask.
Where did I miss
Yeah, it's just on that they just for.
Gosh, I wish I would have like done something with my phone.
It's on that Facebook page.
Email that could be
On the guard, you try and put a wall.
I know, I'm like, oh,
Like the
let's
names
just, oh, there's that.
and, no.
Yep,
like,
same thing.
They always try to provoke us.
I forgot the song.
Sure.
Oh, I hope that's not still on. That would be embarrassing.
Do we have more surveys, some more Karen?
more surveys?
Yeah, they're behind y'all though.
I really appreciate what you have to say. Yeah,
Yeah, those are empty behind y'all. I think I picked one up from there.
No. If anything, I've had the same point that you guys are bringing up. It's just you encounter people who are, part of these communities who don't have that point of view to begin with. So it's like it's hard to try to convince someone who's not in your community, who thinks that you've done harm to them, to really look at it and be like, hey, we can disagree with this. We can be. I can totally think that this image is sacred, but still, sometimes it's right for me to look at it and defend you. And so I just think that there's that dialogue.
Bring it back here.
Across the board.
Okay, I have paused.
But no, I also think it's interesting what the Quran actually has to say about it, because cultural, like Saudi Arabia and